Hello, this is Mickey. How's everybody doing today? Well, today I'd like to spend a little time talking about contrast. And of course, we can't talk about contrast unless we also take into account texture and clarity, because all these tools are contrast-based tools. Now, contrast, texture, and clarity are essentially tools to enhance details or your edges in your photograph to make it appear to have a more focused content. And on the very basic level, it accomplishes this by making whites whiter and blacks blacker. I mean, simply put, it is just that. Make your whites whiter and your blacks blacker. But each one of these tools does that in a very different way, taking tonality or frequency into account to change the contrast in those specific areas. Now, most people will use these tools globally, and they'll randomly move these sliders around until they get the look they want. But once you know the difference between contrast, clarity, and texture, it takes all the guessing out of your workflow and how these settings should be applied. When we apply contrast selectively, it allows us to enhance the photograph. Now, you notice I keep saying globally because it's my opinion that these tools should not be used globally on a regular basis. They should be used selectively with masks. And by applying contrast selectively, we have a better chance of really enhancing our photograph and bringing the viewer's eyes into the area of the photograph we want them to see first. You know, eyes are naturally drawn to areas of high contrast or high frequency. So this is a great way to direct the viewer's eyes to the subject first. Conversely, you can reduce the contrast of some areas you don't want the eyes drawn to. So you are effectively reducing distractions which the viewer's eyes might be drawn to. To start out with, I want to talk about tonality and frequency because these tools or these properties are very important on how these contrast tools are going to apply changes to your photograph. So to start out with, tonality, very simple. If we go up to the top here and look at our histogram, it shows us exactly the 5 tones of tonality that we have. The first is the blacks, and then we have shadows, midtones, which is where a lot of this contrast change takes place. We have highlights, and we have whites. So when we're talking about like clarity, it affects the midtones. What we're saying is that clarity is going to change a lot of the values that it finds in the tonality range. So if we hover over the midtone range, hold our mouse button down and drag left and right, you can see those areas that we're affecting. So any place that's lighting up and getting dark, that is a midtone. So when we apply clarity, that is where a lot of the changes are going to take place. Next is frequency. And frequency is the intensity of changes around your edges. So when we say we have a high frequency area, this is a high frequency area up here at the top. We have a lot of dark limbs protruding into a bright sky. So that gives us a lot of edges that we have big contrast changes from dark limb to white sky. When we have a lot of those, that's a high frequency area. The next area is a low frequency area. Let me zoom in a little bit here. A low frequency area would be the ground or maybe the roof of this little hut. It has a uniform brightness and color and very few edges to it. As you can see, there really aren't many edges. Now, there's texture to it. We can see texture, but it doesn't have the lines like you see in the limbs of the trees or in the bushes. It's pretty uniform in color and almost smooth. And then we have mid-frequency, and this wood in this hut, this would be a mid-frequency. It does have lines, but it's more uniform in color, and the lines actually are more uniform. So when we're using texture, it's going to affect this differently than clarity because clarity is looking for very sharp lines and more of a high to mid frequency, where texture is looking for mid to low frequency to make changes in texture. All right, let's take a look at these tools. The first one is going to be contrast. Now, contrast is one of the oldest tools that Lightroom has had. It's been around forever. It's used globally. You can use it with a mask selectively, but it really doesn't take into account tonality or frequency. It's just a big hammer and it applies to make whites whiter and blacks blacker. So if I grab the contrast slider and slide it all the way over to the right, you can see it's made the whites whiter and the blacks blacker, and we can tell that one by looking at the photograph, but we can look at this tonal sphere and this tonal graph here, and I'll take it back to 0, and you can see we have a good tone spread from black to white, and we have defined blocks in our tonal blocks here. Now let me boost up the contrast. I want you to watch these tools over here, and as you can see, the midtones that start to go away. Whites are getting bigger and blacks are getting bigger. So whites are getting whiter, blacks are getting blacker. And as you can see here, our midtones are kind of blending away. So we have a lot of black and then it starts to get white. And if I reduce it again, you can see here are our midtones. They're right here. But because we've cranked up the contrast, whites get whiter, blacks get blacker. Now honestly, I don't use the contrast slider very much. If I do, it's just a slight touch. But that's what it does. I just call it the hammer of contrast because it just literally doesn't take frequency or tonality into effect. It doesn't even really think about edges that much. It just goes ahead and applies the white whiter and the black blacker. All right, now we're going to look at clarity. Now clarity, it affects the edges in the midtones areas, and edgewise it's looking at mid to high frequency areas to make the changes, which means it's really going to accentuate the details in your image. Now in addition to changing the midtones, the contrast in your midtones, it also has a really big effect on luminance and color. So when you're using a lot of clarity in a photograph, in addition to sharpening the edges in your midtones area, it's going to change the luminance and saturation, which means it's going to make it darker and going to make the colors more saturated. So you have to be real careful when using clarity. Now I'm going to change clarity here just so you can see how it affects in the midtone range, and then we'll run over to a color picture so you can see that too. So I'm going to grab my clarity slider. I'm going to slide it all the way over to 100. As you can see, it's really giving us a lot of detail in our high frequency, even in our mid frequencies areas. It's kind of getting kind of crunchy, and you can see that it's brought out the midtone area of our tonal sphere. So we still have our whites and our darks, but it has widened up the area in our midtone area. And we can also see that in these tonal blocks down here. You can see that we still have, our blacks on the right and our whites on the left, but you can see that the midtones have been more defined, and they actually have a little light around the edge where one block moves into the other. So let me reduce the clarity again. You can see we have a nice even spread and tone across our tools here, but as I increase the clarity, we get more effect in our mid-tone area. We have a much better separation of color, and again you can see the mid-tone areas in our sphere build up a little more than our whites and blacks. Now let me jump over to a color photograph so we can see what happens here. If we apply clarity to this photograph, you can see that we do get more edges, a better edge detection and focus, but you can also see that we're starting to darken areas around our shadows, and we're starting to brighten areas that's in the water. So let me reduce this again so you can see. So we do get a good effect for focusing. If we don't go too far, it starts to look kind of grungy. But you'll see that we'll get changes in here, and here. So let me bring up the clarity again. We're getting good edge detection and edge change for focusing, but we're darkening up these areas. Our greens are getting more saturated, and our areas in the water have lightened up, which now is going to require either exposure highlights or shadows, and probably some vibrance and saturation changes. So while clarity is really good at midtones, and that's the only area that we're really affecting because you didn't see any changes here in the sky, and it has a good edge detection and edge enhancement using the contrast, it does have a problem with luminance, and it does have a problem with color in that it starts making changes that you're going to have to color correct on the back end. So just be real careful and don't get too heavy-handed with that clarity slider. All right, the last tool we want to talk about is texture, and it's actually one of the newest of all the contrast tools that Lightroom has put in place. And it's also the most subtle of the contrast tools. It's a very, very nice tool to make small changes to areas of mid-frequency area of your photograph. I believe it was originally developed for skin smoothing, and it does an excellent job at that. I use it a lot when I'm using portrait work. It also doesn't affect smooth areas of your photograph. And that's one of the main rules of the texture slider. There must be some kind of texture in that area for the texture slider to work. It can't generate texture out of nothing. So you've got to have some kind of, it might even be a granular area like the roof of this, but it's got to have some texture to work. The most important thing to remember about texture, it does not affect luminance or color of your photograph. So it does a good job of subtly focusing in that area or giving it a more focused look, but it doesn't affect luminance or color. So looking at this, I like this mid-range, mid-frequency area here. It really does a good job at enhancing it. If I bring up the texture, you can see we have a nice change in this area right here. And let me let's bring this down like this so we can see our luminance tool. So you can see it's made a change here, but what I really want you to notice is right here is that as we'll take the texture back out, I want you to notice that there'll be no change in our tonal sphere or these tonal blocks no matter how far I crank this up. So you can see we really don't have any change. So when we make changes with texture, we're not affecting the tonality or the color of our photograph, which is a real important feature when we're using texture. So let me bring up a picture of a face only a mother could love, and we'll just zoom in a little bit so we can look at the texture slider. Now, I want to smooth out the skin, so I'm just going to bring the texture slider down to about 30, and as you can see, it does a really good job at smoothing. It's not really affecting a lot of the other parts of the photograph, but on the skin, it is doing a really good job of smoothing it out for the portrait. Now, you can also go too far, it starts to look plastic, but going to 74 on texture is nothing like going to 74 on clarity. And as you can see, we're not even at 74, and it's already lightened the skin. It's given it kind of a glow, and who knows, maybe that's the effect you're looking for, so you would use a lot of clarity. But for the most part, clarity is not going to give you what you need when it comes to focus and skin cleanup. So we'll bring the texture back down. Of course, you can always use clarity and a little to add to it, to enhance it a little more, but for the most part, texture is going to be your tool to go by. If we look at this picture here, we can use our texture to bring it down to smooth out the skin on our musicians. It also hits the instruments just a little tiny bit, but not a lot, because that's a smooth surface. There's no real texture to it, so no matter just bringing it in, it takes some of the shine off of these instruments, but it doesn't really bring the texture down or smooth it like it does on the face. If we bring the texture up, of course, it makes a little more contrasty look on the face, and it does do a little better smoothing or enhancement of the instruments. And we could handle this with some masking. If we just wanted to bring the texture down on the face and bring it up on the violins, then we could do that with masking. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. All right, now that we've gone through the basic tools, I just want to show you how you can use those tools with select masking and apply that contrast to specific areas, how you can really enhance a photograph. Now, we're not going to take these photographs to the very end. I just want to show you how much we can affect with contrast by selective masking these photographs. All right, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab a linear gradient, and I'm going to change the contrast of this field here, because it has a lot of texture to it. So let's bring up the clarity, and you can see it darkens it, which I like. We could actually take the tone down a little bit more and make it a little darker to add depth to our field. And then we're going to grab an object selection, and we're going to quickly mask this house in so we can give that a little more texture. And this one, we're going to use our texture slider, and we're going to bump that up so we can get a better look and feel of what this house is like. Now, we also want this shed to have the same thing, and all we have to do is click the Add button, Object, and since we're going to use these settings by using the Add, we'll just take in this little hut here and see it gets the same settings applied to here. So we don't have to make a new mask and try to figure out what the settings were. We just add to this mask and it'll apply the same settings. Now we want to kind of hit the midground here, and the best way to do that is that we can create a linear gradient. We're going to bring it down here like this, and we are going to subtract the sky. That gives us a good mid-level mask, and I can hit the clarity on this and bring it up a little bit, and you can see it's hitting the house too. So all we have to do right here is subtract object, and we're just going to surround or select our object here, and it takes it out, so we have that. And also we want to subtract here, object, and it takes it out of that mask. So now we're back to just the texture mask that we had on this. And of course we could always just grab the sky. We'll create a new mask, select the sky, and we can use a little clarity there and maybe a little texture to bring out some of the clouds a little bit more. Maybe just drop the exposure a little tiny bit, make it a little gloomier with a little blue, and add a little white to it, give it a more friendly look. So here we have before, after, before, and after, and see how much depth we have to this photograph just by adding contrast to these three areas: the sky, the midground, the house, and the fields. There are 4 areas. So now we could go in and start messing with our color and a little dodge and burn and make this picture really pop. But I think this is a good start just by using selective contrast. Now let's go to one other. This one we want to affect the skin and smooth it down, but we don't really want to affect the sky here. So we're in masking. We're going to select people, and we're going to do the facial skin and the body skin and create mask. And from this we are going to bring the texture down just a little bit, smooth out the skin, and we'll grab the other mask here. We'll bring the texture down a little bit there. We don't really want that affecting the picture, and it does because it's got some mid frequencies. So you can see that when we changed the skin, we got a little change in the photograph too. So what we can do now, again, let's grab a linear gradient. We're going to bring it down to about right here. We're going to subtract the subject, and that cleans that up. So now we can go over to our clarity and bring that up a little bit, bring the texture up a little bit. I'm going to go back to the face mask. We're going to bring the texture down a little bit more. Maybe just give it a little boost on the shadows. So with the 2 masks here, now if we look at the before and after, before and after, we get a smoother skin, and we get a little more depth to the picture because we have put some clarity and brought the focus in a little bit more on the photograph. So it actually looks like more three-dimensional, like it's behind the subject instead of just kind of melting into the subject. And we use the mask on the face of the subject to give the skin a little smoother look. Alright, well, I hope this helps you out. Hope you understand the differences between clarity, texture, and contrast, and you can put that to good use with select masking and applying these contrast features. If you guys have any questions, please drop me an email. Give me a shout out, and I'll be glad to help you any way I can. I will talk to you all soon.